Not going to start recording yet. Oh, it's automatically recording.
Okay.
I guess. Thank you everyone for joining us for our New Works Wednesday, a very special New Works Wednesday with Dr. Sasha Goldstein Sabbah. For those of you who are new to the ASF, new to the ASF's Institute of Jewish Experience, the Institute is dedicated to promoting the beauty, depth, diversity, and vitality of the Jewish experience, which is rooted in the Sephardic experience, in the history of the Jewish communities, the Middle East, North Africa, and beyond. So we're very excited to offer this program with Sasha to talk about Baghdadi Jewish networks. And this is part of a series called New Works Wednesday, where we bring a scholar, usually. Sometimes we also have fiction writers who present their works almost every week. We also have with us Professor Ronnie Perellis, who's chair of Sephardic Studies at the Yeshiva University, and who recently helped us organize the Global Nassau Conference, which was a great online conference. So we do conferences, we do events, we do talks, we do courses. We have some exciting courses available now on the Greek experience, on the Persian experience, on the crypto Jewish experience. And we're hoping at some point in the near future to get back to doing live events, but also continuing some of these. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Professor Perellis, who will do the honors of the proper intro to Sasha. Thank you.
Jason, it's great to be here. I see a wonderful group assembling to learn something on this, at least what is in many parts of the world a very hot day. I'm sure in other parts it is not, and people are coming in from all sorts of places. And I am Professor Ronnie Perellis, the Alkali Chair of Sephardic Studies at Yeshiva University, and I'm a very proud co-sponsor of this series with the ASF as the director of the Rabbi Arthur Schneier Program in International Affairs. This is part of our Diasporas project, and of all the New Works Wednesdays, I mean, I think all of them have connected to getting us to think about the nature of diaspora, the nature of global communities, of interconnecting communities, of communities that challenge and force us to rethink borders and frontiers. And I think today's talk is certainly going to do that for us. And so without further ado, I want to introduce our guest and our scholar today. Dr. Sasha Goldstein Sabbah received her doctorate from Leiden University in the Netherlands in 2019, specializing in the modern history of Jewish communities in the Islamic world. She's the author of Baghdadi Jewish Networks in the Age of Nationalism and co-editor of Modernity, Minority, and the Public Sphere, Jews and Christians in the Middle East. Sasha is currently the digital curator of the Jewish Historical Museum in Amsterdam. As of August 2021, she will be assistant professor of Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands, which is a wonderful piece of news for all of us who care about this material, which is so important. And not to be cliche, but now more than ever, I think this material and being able to think about the past in nuanced, smart ways, giving students and curious lay people the tools with which to make sense of the past in light of the present, I think is really, really an important thing. So I'm really excited to hear more about your work. So welcome.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me to speak today. I'm really delighted to be here. As you can see, it is very warm in The Hague, unseasonably warm after a super cold spell. So if you're having your lunch, enjoy your lunch. If you're having your dinner, enjoy your dinner. I'm delighted to answer questions, but this talk is really related to my book, which came out 2 months ago, Baghdadi Jewish Networks in the Age of Nationalism, which is a revised version of my dissertation. Probably not a big surprise. But just like when I speak with my students, also when I give talks like this, I like to start with an image. And this is perhaps my favorite image in the entirety of the archives I worked in when I was writing this book. And just take a moment. We're not in a let's say, a physical space, so I won't ask anyone to comment, but just take a moment and look at these girls. And this is a picture of the Jewish Girls' School in 1928 in Baghdad. There were other Jewish girls' schools, but this was really the premier Jewish girls' school. You had over 800 students. And how does this picture relate to Jewish networks? Well, if we kind of put on our detective caps, right, we can see the influence of all of these different intersecting networks, religious networks, but also empire, fashion. So let me talk you a little bit through that. The first thing you'll notice is that there's a sign, and the sign says Entraide Scolaire. So the sign is in French. And it's in French because the girls were in an Alliance Israélite Universelle school, right? This is the philanthropy that was started in Paris in 1860, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But this school fell under their curriculum. So these were Jewish girls in Baghdad who spoke Arabic at home, but they were primarily studying in French. But the school was called the Laura Kadoorie School. And who was Laura Kadoorie? Laura Kadoorie was an English woman who married a Baghdadi named Eli Kadoorie, who lived in Shanghai. And Laura died in a fire, but Eli endowed the school in her honor. So they were more Anglophone in Shanghai, and many Baghdadis with the India connection, which I'll also talk about, were Anglophone. But this was a French school funded by British Baghdadi subjects. And if we look at the clothing the girls are wearing, we can also see, or the women, there are also teachers in the picture, that it's certainly Western inspired. But if we look at the food they're eating, it's not Western at all. Some of my students have even said it looks like cigars, but all guesses say they're eating kube, right? So it's cracked wheat stuffed with meat. And you can also really see this influence of modernity when you look at the picture, because these women are looking square at the picture. They're very confident, right? And so you can see this influence. So that's kind of, when we think about Baghdad in the late 1920s or the 1930s, and particularly when we think about Jews in Baghdad in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, we need to think about this Jewish community as a vibrant, globally connected, flourishing Jewish community that was very much integrated into the larger Iraqi society, but also integrated into transnational Jewish networks. And so that's really what my research is about, and how I tried to reconstruct these networks. But I think it's interesting to focus on why this is what I researched. I don't know how much people listening know about Jews in Iraq, but there's certainly a study group, and you have a lot of wonderful books that have come out in the past 2 decades. With that in mind, I think the literature focuses on 2 points. One, on how Iraqi Jews practiced Arab Jewishness, how they were members of the Arabophone Iraqi society, how they engaged with forms of Arab nationalism. And that's something you really find in the works of Orit Bashkin and Aline Schlafler, amongst other people. But you also see this in the biographies or autobiographies of men like Sasson Somech, with Baghdad et Mol, of Naim Ketan, of Nishtim Rejwan, and they show how many Jews, but not all, in Baghdad identified as Arab, describe themselves as Arab, but how all Jews in Baghdad were really part of this society. And then you have other works which showed how Iraqi Jews engaged with Zionism at different levels and engaged with the emergence of modern Hebrew. And that there was kind of this ambivalence. There was interest, but there was reticence. So we have this side about how these Jews were integrated into the Arab world. And then we have these works which look at how Baghdadis really looked at the advent of modern political Zionism. But my research question then was, how did these Jews see themselves within the transnational Jewish world, right? They saw themselves as having this link to Iraq, as having this link to Arab culture. They were kind of interested in Zionism, sometimes not always. But Did they see themselves as being, part of a Jewish network globally? What did they think of their co-religionists? And so that's really what my research is about. And that's what I really tried to show and demonstrate, how these networks work and how Baghdadi Jews began to think of themselves as international Jews, you could say, really beginning in the 1920s. But I always think, I don't know of those of you listening out in the Zoom sphere, what you know about Iraqi Jews. And there's one really important point, which I always like to bring up. Whereas many Jewish communities, for various reasons, are considered immigrant communities, even if their communities have existed in a certain place for hundreds of years, that is not the case of the Jewish community of Iraq. They saw themselves as very much grounded in this space between the Tigris and the Euphrates. And this has to do with their story. I mean, even the biblical story of the exile, and then moving on to rabbinic Judaism and the composition of the Talmud and the centers of learning in Surah and Pumbedita. And we have Benjamin of Tudela, who comments on this community, although he widely overestimates its size. And so on the one hand, the Jewish community really sees themselves as part of the society and as really an intemporal space. Baghdad is really seen as this permanent Jewish space. And the wider, predominantly Muslim, but also Christian communities also see Jews as really the fabric of their society, whether it be part of the Ottoman period or part of the British Mandate or part of an Iraqi state. On the other hand, we can think about how Jews saw themselves within pre-modern Jewish networks. And going along the lines of some of the comments of Matthias Lehmann, if those listening know of his work, I don't think we can really talk about a sense of Klal Yisrael, which will emerge later on. And many Jewish groups are often divided by subgroups, right? So the Sephardi networks, the SMP community, which emerges after 1492, Maghrebi networks, certainly Ashkenazi networks, which shouldn't be bundled all into one, and then Baghdadi networks, right? Networks that originate from Baghdad. And although these networks sometimes intersect with each other, particularly with questions of halukah, also, of course, welcoming travelers, right? Benjamin Tudela, for example, in the 12th century, and then certainly the ransoming of captives, we don't have these wide overarching ideas of one, global Jewish people in the pre-modern world. So what changes, right? And how do the Baghdadi Jews really become part of these changes? And so this starts with some basics in Jewish history, right? In 18th century, 19th century emancipation of Western European Jews, and these ideas that philanthropy, and specifically uplifting Jews in Eastern Europe and the Middle East and North Africa, is a way to combat anti-Semitism and ensure that the rights that Jews have gained in Western Europe through emancipation will become permanent. And so out of this, that's where we get the Alliance Israélite Universelle and the Anglo-Jewish Association. And in parallel to this, you have the emergence of a Jewish public sphere, which in the beginning is also very much felt through Jewish newspapers. And we can talk about Hebrew newspapers of the late Haskalah, which are present in Baghdad, and then also English and French newspapers, and particularly the Jewish Chronicle and the Bulletin de l'Alliance Israélite Universelle. And so these things are happening in the 19th century, where Jews are kind of beginning to think across these Jewish subgroups and thinking, well, how should we interact with each other for mutual benefit? And Baghdad in the 19th century becomes involved with this kind of slowly but surely. And part of this is how they fit into the wider Ottoman modernization processes within the Tanzimat and their willingness to be part of this. And then part of that has to do with actually Eastern European Jews who come to Baghdad in the 19th century and bring the newspapers of the Haskalah and bring information about the Alliance Israélite Universelle. And then communal leaders in partnership with some of these Eastern European Jews actually will write to the Alliance in 1863, I guess, because the school starts in 1864. And they will say, we hear you've built a school in Tetouan, which is in northern Morocco. We would like similar help building a school in Baghdad. And they're successful. And so that's kind of the first official collaboration between Baghdad with an organization in Western Europe and kind of the emergence of one of these networks. In parallel to that, you have Baghdadi Jews who will migrate to India and then later to East Asia, to Shanghai, Hong Kong, Singapore, a little bit to India, to Indonesia. You'll even at one point have a very small Baghdadi group, I believe, in Kobe. And these Jews, for the most part, will not leave because of security issues, although the founding story of the Sassoons is certainly related to that, but they will migrate there for economic opportunity as part of the British Empire. And so this isn't a definitive migration. This is really a back and forth, which will exist throughout the 19th and first half of the 20th century. So in the 19th century, we see the emergence of these two networks already, right? The looking towards these organizations in Europe, and then the expansion of the Baghdadi world into India and to East Asia, and also Baghdadis who will settle in Manchester and London, which is something that which there's certainly room for study on that as well. So what happens by the time we get to the 20th century? How do these networks evolve? And the answer is these networks are very successful. And these networks are very successful because within these Ottoman policies of modernization and later within the British mandate in Iraq, so different mandate, right? Policies of modernization, these transnational Jewish networks are seen as beneficial for building the Iraqi state. They help develop a Jewish school system, which in the beginning is used by many wealthy Muslim and Christian families before there are secular schools developed by their communities. Hospitals will be developed, specialists will be brought in. And so the Jewish community through this network, on the one hand, propels itself into the middle class. And even as early as 1910, we talk about 60% of the Jews in Baghdad being within the middle class. But they'll also kind of begin to be seen as model citizens. So if anybody has studied the Alliance Israélite Universelle, I think, they really call themselves civilizing missionaries. If we look, and of course that's a problematic and loaded term, but if we look at Baghdad in the late 1920s and 1930s, they're very much seen as the success story in terms of the values of both the Alliance and the Anglo-Jewish. Other interesting points within Baghdad, which I always like to bring up, is again talking about this rootedness. In 1924, the Constitution grants citizenship to all Iraqi Jews. So unlike in other places, there is universal suffrage, well, at least suffrage for men, but universal citizenship for Iraqi Jews. So on the one hand, they're becoming much more engaged with these transnational Jewish networks. And on the other hand, they're becoming even more attached to the Iraqi state and serving in the parliament, serving in the cabinet, serving as in the civil service. And these 2 points really come together because often the people who ascend to the highest levels of the Iraqi government or the civil service have benefited from these Jewish networks through the schools, being sent abroad to study. And another kind of fun fact, shall we say, is that in the 1920s, about 25% of the city of Baghdad is part of the Jewish community. So we're really talking about Baghdad as a Jewish city in this period. And in the 1930s and 1940s, this percentage will go down in terms of actual population numbers, but not because the Jewish population is shrinking, just because of rural to urban migration of other communities. So how did these networks work in the 20th century? Well, you have the satellite communities, as I call them, of Baghdadi Jews in Asia and on the Indian subcontinent. And many of those Jews still see themselves as Baghdadis and still see themselves as part of the global Baghdadi community, although they will become primarily British citizens or British subjects if they're able to. And so you have kind of this triangle emerging between Baghdad, the satellite communities in Asia, and Britain. And with this, of course, actually, the Baghdad will become much closer with the Anglo-Jewish Association than with the Alliance Israélite Universelle. And if you know anything about the Anglo-Jewish Association, Baghdad is their main point of interest in the Middle East and North Africa. And this is because of the endowments that come from the Kaduri family and to a lesser extent, the Sassoon family. So that's kind of one aspect of these networks. And then you have the philanthropic organizations. And by this period, you also have the JDC, the joint, which is involved. And they are providing expertise. They're continuing to send teachers, particularly teach English and French. They're providing political support when the situation gets more tense, particularly with Arab riots in Palestine, for example, issues of censorship with bringing in of Jewish newspapers and Jewish correspondence from abroad in the 1920s and 30s. So we've reached a point now where Jewish elites in Baghdad will now contact their counterparts in London or Paris or even New York and say, we're having an issue. Can you use the back channels of your politicking through your consuls or ambassadors in Baghdad to help us resolve this situation? And if you're interested about this, I'm happy to answer questions at the end, or I can tell you where it is in my book as well, of course. And then interestingly enough, you even have the Baghdadi rabbis who begin to seek a similar type of legitimacy. And so there's a conflict by a kind of a splintered Jewish group in Basra, which is in the south of Iraq, in the 1920s. They found a theosophy group. And so it's kind of, it's this philosophy, well, there's a relationship to New York and to India. And it's allowed in the beginning, and the rabbinate just kind of ignores it. And then they found their own synagogue, and the rabbinate's even okay with that. But then they hire a kosher butcher to start doing their own shechting of meat, and they don't charge the gabel, the kashrut tax. And that is a step too far. And so when that happens, the chief rabbi goes nuts. And what does he do? And this is really interesting. Obviously, he has the support of the rest of the rabbinate and of the communal leaders, but his kind of attack on this splinter group is twofold. One, he contacts these Baghdadi elites in East Asia and tells them what's going on. And the Baghdadi elites in East Asia basically say, we'll pay a couple £1,000 to the Basra community if they close up the theosophy group and never speak about it again. And he also writes to some Ashkenazi rabbis in New York and in London, and he asks them to publish public dissents about theosophy. And so you see even the rabbi in Baghdad now using the legitimacy of these transnational networks that go beyond even, what Zvi Zohar would call the Sephardic halachic ethos, but kind of crossing the aisle into the Ashkenazi world. And well, because this talk is co-sponsored by Yeshiva University, I think it's also interesting to note that Baghdadis in the 20s and 30s are being sent to Yeshiva University for training, not so many. And this is also through these networks. So now we're really talking about global networks which cover most continents. And so we know that the Jewish community, not everyone, of course, they knew what was going on in New York because there were a couple of students at Yeshiva University. They knew what was going on in Asia. They knew what was going on in London and Paris. And so kind of the final part of this networks is the multilingual global media space, because the Jewish schools were a mixture of Arabic and Hebrew and French and English. And Jews were reading periodicals in all of these languages. And how do we know this? Well, one thing is I have the lists of banned newspapers from the 1930s. So if they're banned, you know that they were being read. But you also have people writing in these newspapers and discussing issues. So although you don't have any kind of religious reformist movements in Baghdad, minus this whole theosophy debate, you do see Jews making discussions about modernity in Judaism. So an example is when you do your Seder, it should be in Hebrew, but what should the other language be if you live outside of Iraq, but you're a Baghdadi? Should it be Arabic or should it be English? And if your children aren't really comfortable in Arabic, then it should probably be English, but also we want to preserve our traditions. And so you see them beginning to think about this, but also citing what other communities are doing and saying that they hear that other communities are doing this and that. So we know that they're very much part of these networks intellectually because they're questioning their own practice. And so kind of on top of this, right, I mentioned that they're talking about this religious reform. They're making appeals to public opinion. They're writing in Jewish newspapers and non-Jewish newspapers when the situation with the government becomes more complex. There's tension due to unrest in Palestine in the 1930s in particular. And you also see them showing solidarity with German Jewry and later all of Eastern European Jewry, and discussing the efficacy of boycotts of German goods. And we know that they're also influenced by these types of things because the Baghdadi Jews in Shanghai, for example, are instrumental in setting up what's usually referred to as the Shanghai ghetto. But of course, because funds that were usually remitted to Jewish schools in Baghdad are now being diverted to the ghetto in Shanghai, you see Baghdadi Jews adapting to this. And you see that this awareness happens. You also see the limits, of course, of what Baghdadi Jews are able to do, because they're never successful in bringing Eastern European Jews to Baghdad during World War II, but they certainly make applications to try to bring these Jews into Baghdad. So kind of as I begin to wind up, I think when we talk about the Iraqi Jewish experience, and I say this very much in the context of how I started with these wonderful studies which talk about how Iraqi Jews were really part of Arab society or Iraqi society in Baghdad, we need to nuance this experience and understand what I like to, well, this is, let's say, probably a predominantly American group is, I think you need to think about it like your Thanksgiving table, right? Some people are more religious than others. Some people are a little bit to the left. Some people are a little bit to the right. Maybe someone's a communist. Maybe someone is an ardent Zionist. And because Iraqi Jews were so ingrained within Iraqi society, but also part of these networks, you see a huge diversity in nationalist sentiment and general worldview. And if we look at the roles of the communal elites, they weren't simply communal elites. They weren't or court Jews. They were really active on the communal level, the national level within politics and government and civil service, and then on the transnational level within these transnational philanthropies. And it's this mixture which really fuels the socioeconomic mobility of the 1920s and 30s and explains how Iraqi Jews became integrated into so many, multiple cultures. It also, I think, explains why the responses to Zionism are ambivalent. And when I say ambivalent, there's a lot of interest from the cultural and linguistic perspective, but because the 1920s and 30s in particular are really the heyday of the Iraqi Jewish experience, Zionism is not seen to answer a particular issue for the main part, right? So it doesn't seem interesting, although you see discussions where people will say, I understand why Eastern European Jews could be interested in this, although I think they underestimate the complexity of our region, for example. And there are those discussions. So it's an engagement, but of course, they can't look to the future. They don't know what's going to happen. And so they will have these salons where they'll discuss the ideas and the writings that are coming out of Europe predominantly, but there's a general reticence and ambivalence to engage politically, but that doesn't mean that they're not traveling to mandate Palestine and women aren't talking about the freedom of wearing a bathing suit on the beach or finding it funny that you can also go to a Jewish hospital in Jerusalem, just like in Baghdad. So it's there, but it's very nuanced and different from other places. So kind of in conclusion, I think what's most interesting when we talk about this experience is the symbiosis between the communal, the national, and transnational in this period. And that really happens because of these transnational networks, which are established in the 19th century and only grow and are strengthened within the 20th century. And this also speaks to a period of time where multiple networks, so Jewish networks, non-Jewish networks, imperial networks, regional Arab networks are still not perceived as mutually exclusive. And it's with political tension, decolonization, the rise of Arab nationalism, certainly the creation of the State of Israel, that this position becomes more complicated, of course. And there's a lot written on the dissolution of the Iraqi community, which is why I haven't focused on that today. But I think it's, again, I think it's interesting to look at the formation of these networks, because that's really the heart of how you have this flourishing cosmopolitan Jewish community of the first half of the 20th century. So thank you for listening to my talk, and I'm delighted to answer any questions you might have.
Well, Professor Goldstein Sabbah, thank you. That was an amazing tour of a fascinating chapter, and just a very powerful story with that. I'm sure a lot of people in the audience have questions. I haven't seen any yet, but please send them in. And I have a question to begin with, because I don't see a question yet, but I'm sure they'll come in a minute. I'm always interested to see rabbinic crossover, right? Mm-hmm. So, and rabbinic networks. It was interesting to me, you mentioned that with the Theosophists, they appealed to an Ashkenaz in England. And can I just ask a previous question to the Theosophy? Was this some sort of modernizing project, or was it a mystical sort of project?
So this is the big question, right? I write about the Theosophy issue, particularly in terms of challenges to rabbinic authority, and there's some other good literature on it. I think it starts out really as just one of these salons where we discuss new ideas, and it comes out of the Baghdadis in India. And I think it's Chaim Cohen, he even makes the suggestion that because this was a space where men and women could meet socially and it was acceptable, a lot of the youth were interested in it because they could flirt with each other. I mean, that's what and they're saying, you know, Basra in the 1920s is still a very conservative place. And the leadership is willing to take a blind eye, but as this kind of grows and then begins to challenge the rabbinate, that's where it becomes a problem. But interestingly enough, because they always say we're Jews and we're not apostates, and they're not messianic Jews or something like that, or they're not, I think they're just trying to challenge, which is traditionally perceived as a very conservative rabbinate in Baghdad. And I think one of the things that's important to mention is that the chief rabbi of Baghdad is rarely considered the spiritual leader of Baghdad. And the two big examples are the Ben Ish Chai, right? And Abdallah Somech. Neither men ever hold the position of chief rabbi because they don't want to get involved in politics. So I don't think it's spiritual. I think it's really a challenge to the conservative nature of the rabbinate itself. Yeah.
But this is like the Theosophy Society, like in Philadelphia, and kind of New Age sort of.
Yeah.
And you say it has roots in India also. So
this is the weird thing. So it starts, I think Theosophy starts in New York with a woman named Blatvitsky. It's in my book, the name. And then it comes to India because they're kind of mixing New Age Indian spirituality. And so that reaches the Baghdadis in Calcutta. And then because these networks are going back and forth and people will live in Calcutta for 10 years and then move back to Basra and families are exchanging, Theosophy comes to India, Theosophy comes to Baghdad via these routes. And Muslims are never interested in Theosophy. It's really a Jewish thing in Basra, and it's really a footnote. It's just a super interesting example of the complexity of these networks. Yeah. And I think that why did Sasson Kaduri contact Ashkenazi rabbis about this? I think because it was kind of seen as reform and modernity. He was trying to show that he was hip. And he also had an international network, and he could also have rabbis write in English, that it wasn't because they were accusing him of being, very parochial.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah. I was curious also, maybe he was aware of these, of some of the ideas, were they current in England as well?
Yeah.
So we got we got some great questions coming in, as I knew they would be. The first is from, we're very honored to have here Dr. Norma Joseph, I imagine in Montreal right now. Given the 1941 Farhud, doesn't that eliminate the 1940s from the Congenial Network Association history? Yeah, so I'll let you take it.
I can answer that. Okay, so the Farhud, and of course last week was the 80th commemoration of the Farhud, so I did a bunch of talks around this. I think the Farhud is really misunderstood in the sense that there's a political breakdown within the Iraqi state in the context of World War II. And when there is a coup and there's no government, a small group of army officers and police and just general unpleasant anti-Semites attack the Jewish community. And 181 people, according to most reports, are killed. And in today's currency, billions of dollars are damaged the Jewish community, are given damage to the Jewish community. But we need to be really careful about not seeing this as kind of like a lachrymose pogrom, because unlike in other areas, lots of Muslims protected their Jewish neighbors, and they stayed outside of people's houses or they took people into their houses. And in addition to that, after the Farhud, the government recognized the event. They said that it was anti-Jewish violence, that the Jews were in no way at fault, and they made financial reparations to the Jewish community, which were not commensurate with the amount of money, of course, in damages or the loss of life, but they did make reparations. And so sometimes the Farhud is seen as a Kristallnacht, but it's a very different narrative. And so the Iraqi government and many aspects of Iraqi society really tried to make emotional reparations to the Jewish community. And then we have to look at, it's 1941. Where are Baghdadi Jews going to go? They can't get into India at this point. They can't go to the UK. No one's going to Europe. And Palestine is very unstable and you can't get in either. So they stay in Baghdad. And once the British come back in, Baghdad flourishes in 1943, 44, 45. And actually Jewish life improves in Baghdad yet again, and they're continuing to build schools and hospitals, and they're really investing in the infrastructure up until 47, 48. So although in the aftermath of World War II, and this is a combination of the rise of Arab nationalism, anti-British imperial sentiment, and certainly the creation of the State of Israel, the Jewish community will basically dissolve between 49 and 52, when the majority of Jews will immigrate to Israel, and the government will enact what can be considered anti-Jewish policies because they're really paranoid about Zionism. But we can't really talk about that up until 47, for example. So it's complicated because people really like to draw a link between the Farhud as the beginning of the end. But if we look at communal budgets and networks, that's not really the case. The networks are dampened in the early 40s, but they're dampened because of World War II. And there's less exchange because everybody's putting their resources, including the Baghdadis, towards helping Eastern European Jews.
Wow, that's just fascinating. So, so if you don't see it as that portent, is there any other way to understand it besides a reaction, like Arab nationalist reaction to the establishment of the State of Israel that led to that?
In like 47, 48? Yeah, so it's a bit of a complicated situation, because what happens in 48 more or less is that Jews are no longer permitted to leave the country. And so then these networks really are severed, and there are, and Jews have difficulty entering universities because of numerous fixes, and there are multiple problems. So the community is really paralyzed. And then you have a government who comes in and says, okay, if you want to leave, leave. And what they think is going to happen, and again, we never know exactly what happens, is that some Jews will leave and the rest will stay, and the government will be able to say, look, the Jews had the choice. The ones who stayed will consider them loyal citizens, but we don't know. What actually happens is that the majority of people leave, and it goes very quickly. And this is something which we're still trying to understand, but my hypothesis, and people have different hypotheses, is that the communal elites some stayed, but many people left. And there was no social welfare system that we had. Well, the US is building a social welfare system, but certainly in Europe, right? And the majority of the community really depended on the communal organizations. And so as they saw the communal organizations being dismantled, they said, well, if the communal networks are being dismantled and we no longer have these networks, then we have to go, because we're not going to be able to function the way we functioned previously. I just want to say something, because someone put a comment saying the Farhud, there were more deaths than on Kristallnacht. Yes, I realize that. And that's a trope that's been going around the internet. But I think we need to look at what happens in Germany after Kristallnacht and what happens in Iraq after the Farhud. And the reactions are very different. And after that, yes, you will have some people who are hung, certainly, and they probably weren't guilty of anything but sending a letter or a postcard to a family member outside. But we're not talking about mass killings. And a lot of Jews were assisted through Muslim business partners in getting money out of Iraq. So again, it's not about making some ideal convivencia, but at the same time, it's not this lachrymose picture in the 40s either. It's really about nuancing the two and understanding how they work together.
Thank you for balancing that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Professor Perellis, if I may,
please,
take the privilege. So first off, Sasha, thank you so much for this incredible talk. I really, really appreciated it. I also want to mention Aviad is not just our honored guest. The Azrieli Center for Israel Studies at Ben Gurion University is a co-sponsor of today's lecture, and we appreciate that partnership and our work together. I have a few questions for you, but I'll start off with two. One is, what is the percentage of Jews in Baghdad? Because this is also, you're speaking about internet tropes, and this is a frequently contested point about, and you were my source on this to correct that. The second is, you also mentioned the Ben Ish Chai.
Yes.
So I was traveling, and we had an ASF mission to Azerbaijan, and I was in the mountain Jewish village in Azerbaijan. And I noticed all these pictures everywhere of the Ben Ish Chai, and also his writings in the synagogue. His writings are everywhere, and I was interested. Well, how did this? What's the connection with the Ben Ish Chai? And they said, well, the mountain Jews went to Baghdad and studied, and then they came back and they became followers of the Ben Ish Chai. Okay. So another network for you.
Yeah, and I actually, I'll just say with that. I think the relationship between Baghdad and Iran, and as an extension of that, really that area, that region, is understudied, and that would make an amazing doctoral dissertation or research project for somebody who has the language skills to really look at those documents, because we don't exactly understand it, but we do know that there's tremendous exchange between Iran and Iraq during this period within the Jewish community. So right, there's always this issue because there's this trope that 1/3 of Baghdad was Jewish. Okay, so there's some really good demographic information that comes from Hana Batatu, who was actually, I think he was a Palestinian demographer who did most of his career at Princeton. I have the book somewhere back here. If you take that, and then you take the communal numbers reports from the 20s, you see that the percentage-wise, it really never came past 25%, and that was the height. But there were some incorrect British reports, and those have been used. So in my book, I give the numbers and I give all the citations. I don't remember them off the top of my head, but if you take the population sizes from Batatu, and then you cross that with what we assume to be the correct numbers of the Jewish community in Baghdad, that's where you get the 25%. And one other explanation for it is that some of those numbers may have been for the province of Baghdad, but where they would take the province of Baghdad for the amount of Jews, but then the population of the city of Baghdad for the size, and so that may have. Yeah.
Right, which is still great. I mean, it's 25% is still more Jewish than New York today. So.
I know, right? It's massive. I mean, Baghdad was not such a big city back then compared to the city it's grown to, but it truly was a Jewish city, and you had, the traditional Jewish neighborhood, and then you had the market, the shuk, where many Jews had their offices, their khans, which is like for import and export. But then you had middle-class Jews who were moving to kind of the suburbs, and those were mixed middle-class neighborhoods as well. So you can almost think about it, as like New York City, and then people moving to New Jersey. And I think it's really interesting when we look at this from the perspective of what's going on with, American Jewry in the 1930s and 1940s, for example.
Yeah. Yes. There's a question here from my dear friend and I believe almost Dr. Mayor Uni. Can you talk about the afterlife of these networks? Are they reconstituted in some way post 1948? And I'll just say I remember the first Baghdadi Jew I ever met was in my small Ashkenazi synagogue in Miami Beach, and his wife was from Shanghai, and they were from everywhere, and passed through many places. So there definitely is an afterlife. I'd love to hear more about that. So yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, part of it is like, I'd love to do another research project on this, but very simply, well, if we look at the Asian Baghdadi satellite communities, they also fall apart in the late 1940s. And that has nothing to do with Israel, right? Because you have partition in India and you have decolonization, and there's just a lot of uncertainty. And most of those Jews by that time, although not all, certainly have British passports. And then in China, with the rise of communism, I mean, most people are getting out as well. And Singapore, where you still have a Baghdadi community today, which is very interesting. I mean, the synagogues really use the Baghdadi nusach, and it's super interesting. And if you eat there in Shabbat and the community center, they serve you, Iraqi Jewish cuisine. It's super cool. I worked in their communal archives, and I mean, they were even writing to the few Jews who stayed in Baghdad after 1950s. They were in touch with them in the 50s and 60s when you had about 6,000 to 8,000 Jews still in Baghdad. So those networks dissolve. And where do they reform? They reform in Israel, of course, that's where the majority of people go, but they also reform in London and Manchester and New York and Australia. And there, everyone's a Baghdadi. It's not whether you left from Baghdad or Basra, or you left from Calcutta or Bombay, you're kind of Baghdadi again. I would say today, in Israel, I mean, you really have kind of Iraqi or Baghdadi networks, but in other places, you see Baghdadis being much closer with a larger Sephardic network. And that's, I don't have enough time to get into how all of that happens, but going back to the work of Zvi Zohar, I mean, you can understand how Baghdadis, from a religious perspective, see themselves within the Sephardi halachic ethos. And we know that, the rabbis in Baghdad definitely exchanged with Rabbi Uziel in Tel Aviv, for example, in the 30s and 40s. So.
Yeah, and it'd be interesting to do a comparison with other groups like Syrian Jews, that also have an extensive international network, and.
And what's really interesting is, I think part of that, because you brought up the Syrians, is it's very much based on geography, because you do have Halabis who wind up in India and they become part of the Baghdadi community, right? And I can imagine that you have a couple of Baghdadis who wind up in the New York metropolitan area and become part of the Syrian community. So how you position yourself also is who you're around, and you're going to become much closer to that community than joining an Ashkenazi community. But if there's no community to join that's close to your traditions, then you'll join the Ashkenazi community.
Well, we have time for one more question if this thing comes in, but otherwise, I'm really excited to read this book, and thank you for opening a wider vista for us today. I want to thank Jason and the ASF for providing a space for this. I dearly missed Drora today, director of the Institute for Jewish Experience, who's has put together this series. She wasn't able to be with us today. She lost her mother, sadly. But I want to thank you all. I thank the Azrieli Center for Israel Studies, and on behalf of the Rabbi Arthur Schneier Program in International Affairs, it's really been my real honor to be a part of this, and I look forward to many more.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure, and thank you for all of your great questions.
Oh, wait, we have one more question here.
Two more.
From
more
Shelva.
Oh,
Okay.
here-
One from Shelva, and then I have one.
Great
Okay.
question. let's take time.
So Shelva's question, very briefly, I discussed this in my book, but I'll say they basically in Baghdad, and I'm not really sure what happens in India, but other people have written about this, Boaz Hus, Menashe Anzi. In Baghdad, well, in Iraq, because it's really in Basra, Eli Kaduri in Shanghai bribes them with, I don't know, 15,000 pounds, and they get threatened with excommunication. And so they realize it's not in their interest, and it just kind of dissipates.
Do they make it Jewish somehow? Do they like Judaize it? Kind of like some New Age Jewish stuff.
Yeah. That's exactly what it is. It's like New Age Judaism for the 1920s.
Or something. Well, what do they do?
So it's right, like they kind of, it's because it's theosophy, so it's not theology, and it's really spirituality, and they're into vegetarianism and how to better understand yourself. So they see it being compatible with Judaism, but then they kind of make their own splinter community. And what I always find fascinating is the Iraqi government, they obviously side with the chief rabbi, but they don't care about it because the Muslims aren't getting involved. Like, this is a problem for the Jews. We don't have to get involved. It's not challenging any cultural norms. Let them sort out their own problem.
So, very last question. There's so many extraordinary individuals, Flora Sassoon, the Zilka banking family and their network, the beauty queens and the Bollywood stars. What's one interesting story you'd like to leave us with of either a network or a specific individual within that network of the community?
So this is
also say Ezra Rubin Dangor, of course, we have our board president, publisher, rabbi of Burma and Baghdad. So very, very interesting families and people.
Yeah. So I think when we talk like this debate about the 1940s, which I just think is fascinating, is in 1941, still, right before, when you could still travel to Paris before it gets taken over by Germany, you have a couple of girls who are sent to study at the Teachers College of the Alliance Israélite Universelle. World War II breaks out. They flee to the south, to Toulouse, and they get pulled over by the equivalent of the Gestapo in Toulouse. But because they have Iraqi passports, and in that period, this is before the Farhud, they're seen as sympathizing with Germany, they're not deported. The women then go into hiding and survive the war. But after the war, they get considered Jewish refugees by the JDC. And where do they get sent in 45? To Mandate Palestine. And now it's 45, 46, I think. And they don't want to stay in Mandate Palestine. They want to go home to Iraq. And you have a Jewish notable named Ibrahim Nahum, who's part of the Iraqi parliament. And he's traveling to Jerusalem because his wife is getting medical treatment at Hadassah in Kerem. I mean, this just shows these crazy networks, right? And he then uses his political power to get the girls new Iraqi passports, and they migrate back to Iraq in 47. And then 2 or 3 years later, I can't remember, they'll go back to Israel, of course, as the community dissolves. But right there, you see, all like the Alliance Network and then the JDC dealing with refugees. And sometimes they're Iraqis and sometimes they're Jews. But really, until the end, they also see themselves as being part of this Iraqi, this Iraqi Jewish society. So there you go.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's wonderful. And thank you for all the great questions, everybody. Look forward to meeting in person.
Yeah.
In the garden, like in Jason's backyard with some tea, nice tea. All right, everybody. Have a great day. Wonderful.
Thank you so much.